Imagine it's January 3rd, 2026. Nicolas Maduro is in a holding cell in Brooklyn. The news feeds are exploding. The United States just removed a dictator from power. The headlines are screaming about oil, American oil, free oil. Suddenly, there are whispers in the Pentagon and on Wall Street about a massive energy windfall, about Venezuelan crude flooding the market, about American energy independence, about making Venezuela great again. President Trump is already talking about fixing the broken infrastructure and getting the oil flowing. It sounds simple. It sounds inevitable. It sounds like a win. But then you walk into an actual Venezuelan oil field, and you see something that no amount of military hardware or political will can fix quickly. You see pipes so clogged with solidified crude that they look like concrete. You see upgrader facilities that haven't functioned properly in years. You see a workforce that fled the country a decade ago and never came back. You see a power grid that collapses regularly, which means the pumps stop, which means the oil cools down and hardens further. And you realize something that the headlines missed. Capturing the oil fields is easy. Capturing the dictator is easy. But capturing the actual oil? That is a different story entirely. Today, we are going to break down why Venezuela's oil, despite being the largest reserves on the planet, is effectively worthless right now. We are going to walk through the infrastructure trap that makes this resource a liability instead of an asset. And we are going to explain why even the most powerful nation on Earth is about to inherit a nightmare, not a treasure chest. If you want to understand the real economics behind the geopolitical headlines, hit that subscribe button right now. We break down the stories that the mainstream media gets wrong every single week. Let's dive in. Let's start with the real number, $110 billion. That is the estimated cost just to get Venezuelan production back to 2 million barrels per day. That is not maximum capacity. That is not a return to the glory days of the 1990s when Venezuela was pumping 3 million barrels daily. That is just getting back to 2 million. That is a minimum viable level of production. And that $110 billion price tag, that is upfront capital that has to be spent before a single drop of oil reaches a buyer. Now think about what that means. American oil companies have looked at Venezuela's infrastructure. They have looked at the decades of neglect, the collapsed facilities, the cannibalized equipment, the brain drain, and they have collectively said, no thank you. Even with a friendly government in place, even with the threat of sanctions removed, no major oil corporation wants to be the one writing a $110 billion check to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. That money could go to shale development in Texas. That money could go to the Gulf of Mexico. That money could go to exploring new fields in Africa or the Middle East. Why throw it into a country with a history of political instability, currency collapse, and resource nationalism? The answer is they don't. And that is the first crack in the narrative that Venezuela's oil is suddenly worth something now that Maduro is gone. But to truly understand why Venezuelan oil is worthless, you have to understand what Venezuelan oil actually is. It is not the light, sweet crude that flows out of Saudi Arabia or Iraq. It is not the oil that you can pump out of the ground, stick in a pipeline, and ship to a refinery. Venezuelan crude, particularly the massive reserves in the Orinoco Belt, is extra heavy and sour. It is so thick, so viscous, so fundamentally difficult to work with that it is essentially solid at room temperature. Imagine a river of tar. Imagine crude oil that behaves more like asphalt than gasoline. That is what comes out of the Orinoco. Now, the technology exists to process this oil. The upgraders, the massive industrial facilities, can break down these heavy molecules and turn them into something exportable. But there is a critical step that most people do not understand. You cannot move extra heavy crude through a pipeline without first thinning it out. You need to mix it with something called a diluent, typically naphtha, which is a lighter hydrocarbon that reduces the viscosity enough for the oil to flow. It is like mixing concrete with water to make it pourable instead of solid. Without the diluent, the crude hardens in the pipes and clogs them. And here is where Venezuela's trap becomes obvious. Due to years of economic crisis and international sanctions, Venezuela has essentially run out of diluents. The country cannot import them. The country cannot produce them. So the oil, the literal oil that is supposed to be Venezuela's salvation, is stuck in the pipes. It has cooled down. It is solidified. You cannot just turn a valve and expect the oil to start flowing again. The pipes are clogged with concrete-like crude. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal state of Venezuela's oil infrastructure in January 2026. Now, assuming somehow you could get diluents back into the country, you would still face the upgrader problem. Venezuela has 4 critical upgrading facilities: Petropiar, Petromanagas, Petrocedeño, and Petro Roraima. These are not small operations. These are massive industrial complexes that cost billions of dollars to build. Each one is designed to process hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. But as of January 2026, most of them are operating at less than 20% capacity. Some are offline entirely. Why? Because Venezuela has spent the last 5 years in a state of complete desperation. When a pump breaks down, PDVSA, the state oil company, does not order a replacement part. There is no money. There is no credit. So instead, they cannibalize another pump. They strip the parts from a machine that is barely running to fix another machine that is also barely running. This is called technical necrophagy. It is the process of killing one system to temporarily sustain another. After 5 years of this, there are no spare parts left. The upgraders are holding together with duct tape and prayers. A single catastrophic failure in one facility could take months or years to repair. And unlike a commercial operation where you can call a supplier and order parts, these are specialized industrial machines built in the 1980s and 90s, with suppliers that have long since gone out of business or moved on to other markets. You cannot just order a replacement compressor for a 25-year-old upgrader facility. You have to either rebuild it from scratch or scrap the entire unit and build a new one. But even if you could somehow get all 4 upgraders running at full capacity simultaneously, you would still face a problem that is even more fundamental. There are no engineers left to run them. In 2002, when the oil workers went on strike, the government panicked. Instead of negotiating, instead of accepting that they had to live with organized labor, Hugo Chavez made a decision that would haunt Venezuela for decades. He fired nearly 20,000 engineers, geologists, technicians, and skilled workers from PDVSA. He replaced them with political loyalists, people who had never worked in the oil industry before, people who were hired because they voted the right way or knew the right general. 20,000 trained engineers and skilled workers fled the country. Many went to Colombia, many went to Spain, many went to the United States. They found jobs in the American oil industry. They found jobs with international oil companies. They used their skills and their experience to become valuable members of the global energy workforce. And they never came back. Today, the people running Venezuela's oil rigs are often political appointees with no experience, or they are underfed workers earning a wage that has been destroyed by hyperinflation. In the early 2020s, a worker at PDVSA earned roughly $6 per month. $6. You cannot attract talent with that. You cannot motivate people to maintain complex industrial machinery with that. The best and the brightest have gone. What is left is a skeleton crew of inexperienced people desperately trying to keep the lights on. You cannot rebuild a complex industry without the experts. You can inherit the physical infrastructure, but you cannot inherit the human capital that knows how to operate it. But let's say somehow you could solve the diluent problem, the upgrader problem, and the brain drain problem. You would still face a hurdle that makes all of those challenges look trivial. Electricity. You need massive amounts of electricity to pump and process heavy oil. The pumps that move this thick crude through the pipelines consume enormous amounts of power. The upgrader facilities consume even more, and Venezuela's power grid is a disaster. The Guri Dam, which supplies the majority of Venezuela's electricity, has effectively collapsed due to years of neglect and lack of investment. Regular blackouts are not unusual. Regular blackouts are the norm, which means the pumps stop working, which means the oil cools down inside the pipes, which means it solidifies again, which means it clogs. You are in a perpetual cycle. You get the power back on. The oil starts flowing. It reaches the upgrader, but then the power grid fails again, the pumps stop, the oil hardens, and you have to start over. It is like trying to keep a fire burning while standing in a rainstorm. No amount of infrastructure investment in the oil industry matters if the power grid continues to collapse every other week. And rebuilding the power grid, by the way, is another $100 billion project that nobody's volunteering to pay for. But let's assume again that by some miracle you could solve all of those problems. You could get the diluents, fix the upgraders, bring back some engineers, rebuild the power grid. You would still face a legal nightmare that is almost impossible to overcome. Venezuela has massive debts. The country owes more than $150 billion to creditors. Some of that debt is owed to China. Some is owed to Russia. Some is owed to international bondholders and to a Canadian mining company called Crystalex that won a judgment against Venezuela years ago for seizing their gold mine. Now, when Venezuela sells oil, the revenue from that sale does not automatically go to the government. It is at risk of being seized by creditors. Every single tanker that leaves a Venezuelan port is potentially subject to legal attachment. A creditor can go to a court in New York or London and say, "That oil was supposed to pay my debt." Freeze that shipment, seize it, sell it, use the proceeds to pay me back. And this happens regularly. In fact, Venezuela has lost millions of dollars in oil exports because tankers were seized before they reached their destination. Now, imagine this scenario. The United States takes control of Venezuela's oil production. The first tanker leaves port carrying 1 million barrels of crude worth roughly $60 million. Before it reaches a buyer, a court orders it seized to pay back China's debt to Venezuela, or Russia's debt, or Crystalex's judgment. Who gets that money? Does it go to the new Venezuelan government? Does it go to the United States as compensation for the military operation and infrastructure rebuilding? Or does it go to the creditor? This is a legal nightmare that could tie up Venezuela's oil exports in courts for years. Every barrel becomes a contested asset. Every sale becomes a legal battle. And nobody wants to buy oil that comes with that kind of title risk. You cannot sell a product when there is a real possibility that a court will seize the shipment before it reaches the customer. And then there is the China problem. Venezuela owes China roughly $50 billion. The way this debt was serviced, particularly under Maduro, was with oil. China would give Venezuela credit to buy goods. Venezuela would pay it back with oil shipments. It was a barter system disguised as international finance. Now, if the United States takes over Venezuela's oil production, what happens to those obligations to China? Does the United States continue sending free oil to China to pay Maduro's debts? If they do, they're essentially subsidizing Beijing's position in Latin America. If they stop, China gets angry. And an angry China could cut off support to other American interests, could retaliate in Africa, could make things difficult in the Pacific. It is a geopolitical lose-lose scenario. The oil that was supposed to be a gift to the American economy is actually a political liability that connects directly to the China relationship. So here we are in 2026. The United States has removed a dictator. The headlines are screaming about Venezuelan oil. The narrative is that America now has access to a massive energy resource, but the reality is far more complicated. The oil is there, yes. The reserves are real. But getting that oil out of the ground, upgrading it, shipping it, selling it, and keeping the revenue without it being seized by creditors is a project that will take 10 to 15 years and require tens of billions of dollars in upfront capital investment with no guaranteed return. The oil fields are not a treasure chest waiting to be opened. They are a rust bucket of corroded pipes, solidified crude, cannibalized equipment, and a workforce that does not exist anymore. Even the most advanced oil company in the world would balk at this challenge. The United States just inherited a liability dressed up as a windfall. The oil bonanza that Trump promised is a myth. Venezuela's oil is not suddenly worth something now that Maduro is gone. If anything, the removal of Maduro has exposed just how worthless the oil actually is, without the infrastructure, the expertise, the power grid, the diluents, and the legal clarity to actually extract and sell it. The trap is not that the oil disappeared. The trap is that the oil was never as valuable as everyone pretended it was. And now, the entire world is about to find out just how expensive it is to discover that truth. If you found this breakdown of Venezuela's infrastructure nightmare valuable, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that people care about the real economics behind the headlines. And subscribe if you want to understand how nations that look rich on paper can actually be completely broke. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the United States will actually try to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry, or will they realize it is not worth the investment and leave it to rot? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.